Do they go for an extra round of mobilization and try and win the war? Probably next year. This is not a popular war anyway, and it'll be even more unpopular if wealthy people's or wealthy Russians' children are dying in it. It's going to come down to who's got greater will and is willing to take more risk. I think in part, Putin's been upping the strikes on Ukraine, obviously with an eye on the G7 summit and NATO summit, all the other things that have been going on. And this has been going on for a period of time, that they've been increasing the tempo against Ukraine. Ukraine actually, in turn, increasing the tempo against Russia, really bringing the fight to Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other major Russian cities. And indeed, Russia facing oil shortages, petrol shortages, certainly nationwide. So I think it's a combination of factors for Russia. It's an acceleration of a trend they've been pursuing. But obviously, this is a time for them to keep the pressure on for so many reasons, really in line with Russian strategy. Trump has definitely changed tone recently in terms of how he's talking about Ukraine. He's actually started blaming the Russians, saying the Russians are actually being intransigent about peace, which is a realization it's taken him some time to come to. But obviously the Ukrainians and others have been saying for the last few years that the ball is in Russia's court to end this. Russia can end this whenever it wants. Ukraine can't. Ukraine just has to keep fighting. So I think there has been a change of tone, as with everything to do with Donald Trump. We'll see how long it lasts. But it's a ray of optimism, I think, in the last few weeks, and certainly going into the NATO summit in Ankara, as we sort of look at this potentially changed US trend. But what matters is not what Trump's saying from moment to moment or the administration. It's what actually happens as a result. What extra support does Ukraine get? They're looking at things like building their own missiles under license, quite advanced equipment and things like that. And US support in doing that, I think, would be a major step for Ukraine. We'll see if that happens. But what we certainly have seen is a big transition from the disastrous meeting in the Oval Office early in the Trump administration. Things are rebalancing. I think things like the Alaska meeting that Trump had with Putin, that did not yield results. I think those things are starting to wear on him. So Ukraine, especially, having a sense of optimism at this point, I think, about the changing direction again with the US. And to be fair, I mean, there are political developments to come up in the US later this year. And so I think people are saying, well, actually, if you have effectively a transfer of power, certainly in Congress in the midterms, that's probably only good for Ukraine. And so I think further optimism looking further ahead as well. I mean, it's a sweep of support that Ukraine needs. They've done more and more of their production indigenously, some under license, but actually they've also started building quite improved equipment. For example, they're building their own armored personnel carriers now to a new design based on what they found to be successful on the battlefield. So it's quite wide ranging. But what they can't entirely do themselves are things like advanced air defense missiles. They're under a lot of pressure for those. Russian ballistic missiles are the weapons that get through, and we've seen that in the last 24 hours. We've seen it time and time again, actually. Drones are more numerous. They're a numbers game. They're easier to counter if you can find them. But the ballistic missiles are deadly when they strike, and that's an area that Ukraine's looking at. So particularly license building, Patriot for them is very important. But other than that, the continued flow of support, of money, that allows Ukraine to bend its own resources to the task and again supply those things that they just can't. But where they've been very effective is in drone warfare, in developing their own longer range missile systems. But that continued flow of money, always required for warfare, support, intelligence support, insight, technology sharing, all of those things are what Ukraine would love to see. And this, no change really in that commitment to them, certainly from Europe, and hoping that the US actually gets back more on board and we get back to where Ukraine was a couple of years ago in terms of US support. Ukraine laid out a plan a couple of years ago, people may remember. There was their victory plan, and a part of that was targeting of Russian strategic assets. And at the time, it seemed somewhat far-fetched, but Ukraine has dedicated its effort to that over an extended period of time. They built capable systems to target Russia, and they've calculated Russian vulnerabilities quite carefully. So the damage that Ukraine's doing to Russian oil and gas supplies, Russian fuel supplies, is marked. It's stopping Russia from getting money. It's bringing the war to the Russian people. They're feeling the effect of fuel shortages. Putin's even acknowledging the effect that's beginning to have. And of course, drone operations over the major cities that have largely been insulated from the conflict are no longer rare. They used to be an occasional thing. It would almost be exciting, I think, for people in Moscow or St. Petersburg. There were some drones flying around. There was some disruption at airports. And now it's a fairly steady barrage, actually. Kyiv here very much taking back to Moscow what Moscow had sent to Kyiv over the last few years. So there's a lot of reality in Ukraine's strategic plan there. And they've certainly countered Russia at sea, for example. They've been very effective against Russian aircraft by unconventional means, but they've damaged a lot of the Russian bomber fleet. They've damaged a lot of the Russian airborne warning equipment, which is very important actually for the Russians. And that's probably the biggest loss they've suffered in the air. So, Ukraine's pushed forward on a number of fronts, but they are losing ground steadily, but slowly in parts of the Donbas. And Russia's maintaining its focus on taking the big cities left in northern Donetsk. And they're just inching closer to that goal at vast cost in lives and effort. And the big thing now is how deep Russia will start to dig into its manpower in terms of, do they go for an extra round of mobilization and try and win the war probably next year? And by win, I mean gain the territory they've said that they own, many of parts of which they don't sit on at the moment. And do they have the capacity to do that? Do they have the will to do that in their society? And does that overwhelm the Ukrainians? So it's not a done deal for either side at this point, to be honest. It's going to come down to who's got greater will and is willing to take more risk, I think, particularly with manpower as we go into the next year or so. But Ukraine fighting for every inch. And there's a reason they're doing that. It's dragging it out for the Russians. It's making it harder and harder for the Russians to achieve their goals. And so I think Ukraine on the front foot strategically in some ways, under steady attrition on the battlefield, because the Russians are just willing to keep grinding. They're willing to keep infiltrating forward and pushing away at those Ukrainian cities, whilst also hammering the rest of the country, as we've seen. And the winter's always hard because of that damage to the electricity grid. Ukraine's used to it by this point, but it's definitely a harder period of time. Conversely, it's harder to make ground on the battlefield for the Russians. So they tend to push harder in the summer on the front lines, and then they push more strategically over the winter. But that fighting, of course, just going on constantly in and around those front lines and grinding away day after day. The risk that Ukraine is ultimately taking is, how far they need to push the population to slow the Russians down enough to eventually force a ceasefire. And there's multiple parts of that. The long-range strikes are a part of it. Targets on Russian prestige are a big part of it, bringing the fight to the Russian people so that they actually are aware. They can't ignore this operation anymore and pretend it's not happening or it's a long way away from them. And of course, grinding away at the front line does start to do that, because eventually you have to tap into manpower reserves that you've left alone if you're Russia, which is, again, is population of the major cities, trying to keep the war away from those big bastions of Russian power, if you like. And so for Ukraine, the risk is just not managing to hold the line, not managing to bring enough forward, exhausting reserves. And that's not a risk that's entirely in Ukraine's control. That's where it's so important they continue to have the support that they've had to keep them in the fight. Because without doubt, if they hadn't had that, Ukraine would not be in this fight. And just doing enough to get the Russians to stop. There is ultimately the risk if they really, really, really hammer Russia, arguably with our support, and put Russia in a situation where this crisis becomes existential, then of course Russia might lash out more, might act out more in terms of its fears for its stability. And by that, I don't mean nuclear, which is obviously at the very far end of the Russian arsenal. If they were going to do that, they've had opportunities before, and I think they understand this is not something they can do in a valid fashion at the moment. It's more, again, Russia actually taking the pain, bringing forward significant reserves and really piling on to Ukraine, I think is the risk. At the moment, it's not worth Russia doing that. They've calculated they can achieve their ends by steadily grinding forward within the sort of reserves they're calling forward each year with their conscription each year. And they haven't particularly accelerated that, but it's whether they now do so, because that would give them an extra few 100,000 people at the front line. That could start to make a real difference in this sort of conflict. Now, the casualties would go up a lot as well, but is that the calculation that Moscow starts to look at? And particularly if they're coming under real strategic threat. losing money through oil revenues, and of course the oil price currently pretty low as well. So Russia living a bit high earlier this year, now really beginning to struggle, and the Russian people beginning to really feel it. I think the Kerch Bridge has long been a sort of effectively a propaganda target. I mean, it became difficult for the Russians to use in many ways anyway. It's been targeted multiple times, been damaged. But they were relying quite a lot actually on ferries across the strait for heavy logistics, and they were destroyed the other day. So Ukraine's already put a lot of pressure on that route. It is a symbolic target. I think there's a reason there's been less attempts to go for it at this point. There are more pressing concerns, and Ukraine's calculated that actually choking off Russia's revenues. And again, that's not just through military action, but also trying to get the West to impose greater sanctions to actually stop the shadow fleet at sea and things like that. And again, that's where Russia's escalating back against supporters of Ukraine. There's a lot going on in the maritime domain. Those sorts of areas, I think, is where Ukraine's calculated greater pressure lies. Now, for Russia, they're not looking for an excuse to escalate per se. But of course, some things could happen that might force that or allow the Kremlin to say, actually, we've got popular support to escalate, because that's their big fear. This is not a popular war anyway, and it'll be even more unpopular if wealthy people's or wealthy Russians' children are dying in it, which currently they're not. So that's the huge risk for the Kremlin. What pushes them into that? Would it be, and this would almost certainly be an accident, because neither side's particularly targeting civilians as a priority, but civilians are obviously under threat. But say mass civilian casualties in the central Moscow or St. Petersburg, probably because of something going wrong. That sort of thing that was hard to ignore. Those are the sorts of triggers that might be there. But I don't think Russia's looking for those triggers. They're trying to keep this managed, or at least present the idea this is managed. Yes, we're taking some pain. That's understandable. It's under control. That's the message they keep trying to send. I mean, they're calling it still a special military operation. They're arguing it's limited. They're trying to keep acting like it's limited. So escalation is a dramatic step for Russia, and something they'd probably only do if they're reaching a point that actually they calculated that if they didn't, they'd lose. Russia's been pushing the boundaries of supporters of Ukraine throughout the conflict. In large ways and small ways. They've weaponized migration. They've called on criminal groups and effectively used networks that they had officially, unofficially, to take action, as we've seen in the UK, against targets. They have inspired actions against Western interests. There have been a lot of activity around subsea cables. There's been obviously cutting of cables by deniable or somewhat deniable means. And so Russia's constantly pushed the boundaries. They've moved, for example, on the border with Estonia, they've moved the buoys in the river. It's small things. Some things are truly pathetic. Some things are quite impactful. And they're going to jump on every opportunity that may arise due to circumstance. For example, Ukrainian drones being pushed off course in the Baltic. That was actually due to jamming. The Russians, of course, then saying, well, NATO nations are allowing these missiles to go through their territory. I mean, no one's doing that. You'd be pretty stupid to do it, because that provided a pretext for provocation. I mean, even the Russians know that wasn't what was happening, because they put the jamming in place to the extent that actually it's quite hard apparently to get an Uber in major Russian cities at the moment due to the jamming of geolocation GPS services. But there is therefore loads of scope for Russia to do things that just push up the danger feeling for Western countries. And that's what they're seeking to achieve. They want us to get scared, to pressure Ukraine to stop, to cease our support. They want our societies to turn against the Ukrainians. And they put a huge amount of time and effort into that message and signaling to us that they can do things and they can provoke. And so there's certainly scope for escalations. I think they'd always be limited, but that's a realistic, constant possibility. And of course, in that environment, there's a chance that accidents happen. They're seen as provocations, and things escalate, even if that wasn't Russia's intent. So it's a slightly dangerous game to be playing, but that's the aim of it. They want us to be feeling in danger. They want us to be feeling in jeopardy, so that we don't want to take risk. But of course, Russia's taking risk in doing this as well. They're certainly not ready at the moment to fight the rest of NATO on top of Ukraine. But I would caution that in due course, that's a fight they are preparing for. They'd love to break NATO, but they're not planning to do it militarily as such. They want to do it more politically. And if limited military objectives allow them to do that, for example, an incursion that doesn't trigger Article 5 or leads to arguments within NATO or the US not turning up, That would be something the Russians would love to see. So they're going to carry on pushing all of our boundaries.